The number that James Randall gives is about 300 northern newspapers that were shut down, and the telegraphs were all censored. And so, and to this day, Lincoln himself made the argument that, well, yes, this will all end. When the war is over, there will be no long-term repercussions. Well, if he were alive today and would listen to Rush Limbaugh, he would probably change his mind, because they're still invoking the legend of Abraham Lincoln to advocate these same sorts of attacks on civil liberties today, to this very day. Habeas corpus, the last speaker mentioned that. Lincoln unilaterally suspended habeas corpus. Even his own Attorney General, Robert Bates, said this was unconstitutional, because it is constitutional to suspend habeas corpus. Not that that's a good thing, but it is in there, but it's under congressional powers, not executive powers. And so, and besides that, after the war in 1866, the Supreme Court, which was, filled with Lincoln appointees, by that time, said that it was unconstitutional to have suspended habeas corpus, because as long as the civil courts are operating, neither president nor Congress has the right to do that. And the court in that decision thought it was a very dangerous precedent, because after all, future governments, it would give future governments who are run by tyrants an incentive to create or generate a crisis, or the perception of a crisis, as an excuse to suspend habeas corpus. And so this was one of the wiser decisions that you're going to read about on the part of the Supreme Court with regard to civil liberties. And so we did that, and tens of thousands of northern civilians were imprisoned with no due process. The history profession seems to have settled on the number of 13,000, but I ran across a Columbia Law Review article that said it was more like 30,000, and somehow that article is always ignored and never cited by anyone except me, it seems like. And so tens of thousands, Dean Sprague in his book, Freedom Under Lincoln, noted that you had all these people in gulags, like Fort Lafayette and New York Harbor, without due process. Sometimes their families didn't even know what happened to them. And Sprague mentioned that the only place in the northern states during the war where there really was genuine free speech was inside these prisons. Because if you're already in prison for free speech, what have you got to lose? And it wasn't just suspected spies or traitors, because after all, there was no due process. So how would you know? How would you know who's a spy and who's not a spy? It was virtually anyone who would speak up against the Lincoln regime was fair game for being thrown into these prisons. There was another thing that happened. Another reason why the enemies of liberty seem to love Lincoln so much is not only this. Not only did he suspend habeas corpus and censor the press, but when Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the United States, issued an opinion as a circuit court judge that it was unconstitutional to do this, an opinion that the Supreme Court as itself in 1866 would endorse, Lincoln issued an arrest warrant for the judge. Now, I didn't mention this in my first book because I only had one reference to it. And, but since then, I devoted a short chapter to it in my new book, because I have 4 or 5 very good references that this did happen. One of them is the memoirs of Benjamin Robbins Curtis, who was the Supreme Court justice who wrote the dissenting opinion in the Dred Scott case and who defended Andrew Johnson in his impeachment trial. And he mentioned that Taney knew there was an arrest warrant out for him. The mayor of Baltimore, Mayor Brown of Baltimore during the time, was a personal friend of Judge Taney, and he mentions in his autobiography that Taney knew Lincoln had issued an arrest warrant for him. There's a history of the Federal Marshal Service that mentions this also. Also, a book by Ward Layman, who was Lincoln's law partner and who worked for him in the White House. He mentions this. This was my original source of this. And so this happened. Lincoln responded not by going to court and making his case for the suspension of habeas corpus by himself, but by intimidating the Chief Justice of the United States. And another thing that I dug up in my second book is that there were other federal judges that were intimidated like this. I published a part of a whole letter from a federal judge in Washington, D.C. in the new book to his fellow judges explaining why he did not show up for court one day. And what he said was that he was intending to show up for court to issue a writ of habeas corpus for a young man who had been imprisoned by the Lincoln administration. And to keep him from issuing the writ, his home was surrounded by federal soldiers so that he was pretty much under arrest and kidnapped by federal soldiers so he could not go to court. And I found several other letters in the archives like this from federal district court judges who were prohibited from issuing writs of habeas corpus. So this was apparently a pretty widespread practice. And again, that's the type of thing any tyrant would love, which is why it's very, very dangerous that a man like Lincoln has been made into a saint. And to this day, you see mostly neoconservatives who just can't get enough of Lincoln quotes, trying to justify everything and anything they do that is constitutionally dubious by invoking the legend of Abraham Lincoln. There was sort of an entertaining little episode a few weeks ago where a well-known Washington pundit and a neocon got into a little bit of trouble by putting a fake Lincoln quote into one of his columns, where he quoted Lincoln as essentially saying that any opponents of the war ought to be hanged or executed. And it turns out that this quote was actually the paraphrasing by a Washington Times journalist of what he, the journalist, thought Lincoln's opinion was. It wasn't an exact quote that they should be hanged. The opponents of the war should be hanged. And so this created a little stink for a couple of days in Washington punditry. But as it turns out, Lincoln's position was exactly that. You know, that exact quote may have been incorrect, but here's what Lincoln said in the collected works of Abraham Lincoln. You can find him saying this, quote, "The man who stands by and says nothing when the peril of his government is discussed cannot be misunderstood. If not hindered, he is sure to help the enemy. Much more if he talks ambiguously, talks for his country with buts and ifs and ands," end quote. So he's saying that it's treasonous for a man to stand by when, say, the war is being discussed and to remain silent. And of course, at the time, the ultimate penalty for treason was execution by hanging. And so I think by a simple step of logic, I think this Washington Times writer, I think that's probably where he got the idea that Lincoln was in favor of hanging the political opposition. If he was willing to say silence is a crime, surely speaking up against us is even worse at wartime. And so in this particular article, they were using, it was called, they had a title of something like, should war opponents be imprisoned? That was the theme of the article, should war opponents be imprisoned? And of course they used the example of Lincoln as to make the case that, well, maybe they should be. Maybe they should be imprisoned. And they used the example of Congressman Vallandigham from Ohio, who was Lincoln's most outspoken Democratic Party critic. He resigned from Congress to run for governor of Ohio, and he kept it up. He was just pounding on the suspension of habeas corpus and the mass arrest of civilians and all these acts of the Lincoln regime. And Lincoln had made the argument that he was encouraging desertion by doing that, and so did some of his lieutenants, the military people who were spying on Vallandigham. And so by being such a harsh critic of the Lincoln regime, he was in effect discouraging enlistments or maybe even encouraging desertion in the army. So Vallandigham was arrested. 67 armed soldiers broke down the door to his home in Dayton, Ohio one night in April of 1863 and dragged him off to some gulag. And they made a big show of handing him over to a Confederate Army commander in Tennessee because they wanted to make the impression that, well, here, you're with your people now. You're a spy, you're with your people now. But the Confederates did not want to have anything to do with a congressman from the same state that Sherman and Grant were from. He was not one of them. He was from Ohio. So he ended up going into exile in Canada. And then the Republican Party still didn't give up on him. They used their propaganda arm that was called the Union League to spread rumors that he was sort of, Vallandigham was orchestrating the New York City draft riots from Canada.